my channel. My name is Andy, sometimes Mouse, and I talk about books and book-related things, and today I am finally talking to you about sequel syndrome. I've referenced this video a lot and how I wanted to film it, but I just hadn't had time, didn't have it scripted, etc, etc. So I am finally sitting down and filming this. I will give my regular disclaimers. There are animals that live in my house. I do not have control of them. If you hear sounds, etc, etc, it is them. Also, if you hear my fan, it's because I live in Texas and it's like 94 degrees outside, and what can you do, you know? So let's go ahead and get this show on the road. I'm first going to explain what sequel syndrome is. The game plan for the video here is I'm going to explain to you what sequel syndrome is in my opinion, and then also with some definitions written by different book reviewers, bloggers, etc. Then I am going to tell you the not so good sequels and the really good sequels. I will have some that I explain in depth, and then I will have honorable mentions that I'll just mention, but I won't really get into the details on. So what is sequel syndrome? Generally this term is used for movies and not necessarily books. However, the book community does like to adapt that term to books itself. This is often called the middle book syndrome or the second book slump. Also, these are, some other terms and definitions that people have given it when referring to it with regards to books. It generally refers to when an author's second book didn't live up to the first book, especially if it's part of a series. A lot of the time in duologies or just trilogies, a lot of them, the second book doesn't quite live up to the magic of the first book. It's very hard to recreate that story and that experience in a way that is satisfactory to readers. When it's a duology, that just sucks because you don't always get a very good conclusion. And when it's a trilogy, it's very blatant that the second book, oftentimes, it's very blatant that the second book is simply a bridge to put together the beginning and the end. And a lot of the time, if you read like a really long fantasy book, that's a standalone book, a lot of the time people will say, it lulled a little bit in the end there, but it picked back up towards, it lulled a little bit in the middle there, but it picked back up towards the end. That feeling is what sometimes sequels have the tendency to feel like, an entire book that lulled a little bit throughout the entire book just to bridge you to that very last book in the series. It also has the tendency to not feel like there's any kind of development or character development. It's a lot of like laying out things that have already happened or setting up characters for things that are going to happen in the third book, which is not very satisfactory if it's not done well. And a lot of the time, it's not done well. I'm going to take my glasses off real quick. Give me a moment. For the first section of not so good sequels, I am going to be talking about books that didn't need to be duologies, specifically. Now, this can be books that should have been a trilogy, so there wasn't enough time given to the book to develop itself, or why was this written, you didn't need to write this. You definitely did this for a money grab. You could have left the standalone and you decided not to. So I am going to start with Hollow Heart by Marie Rutowski. Personally, I did not rate this book as a low book. I think I rated about 3 or 4 stars. However, it's because I read the Winter's Trilogy. The Winter's Trilogy is set in the same world, but it's a completely different story in a different timeline than the second book from Hollow Heart. Which, the first book, if you don't know, the first book is Midnight Lie, the second book is Hollow Heart. Hollow Heart brought in a lot of the characters from the Winter's Trilogy and explained a lot of lineage and situations that happened post Winter's Trilogy. Unfortunately, Winter's Trilogy has a lot of tropes and such that don't sit well with a lot of readers. I didn't really love them either, but I don't have the languaging in order to go into that, and that's also not what this video is about. And so a lot of people felt that the Midnight Lie was a little bit refreshing from the Winter's Trilogy if you had read the Winter's Trilogy. But a ton of people have never read the Winter's Trilogy. They went into the Midnight Lie because it is a queer fantasy novel, and Midnight Lie was a fantastic book. However, Hollow Heart is not. It builds off of a storyline from the Winter's Trilogy that so many people never read and have no interest in picking up, and I understand that. And it uses that world and that lore and that plot from Winter's Trilogy to grow itself off of the Midnight Lie. But unfortunately, the Midnight Lie just barely used that world. So when you put those two together, it didn't really make sense because you didn't already have that build out in that thorough of a way in the first book. But then in the second book, you spend a ton of time going over the first 3 books in a completely different trilogy, going over the history, the world building, and the lore, but nobody picked that book series up, Midnight Lie, with the intention of recapping the Winter's Trilogy. That wasn't the Winter's Curse, the Winter's Trilogy. That wasn't what they wanted. They wanted a queer fantasy book, and instead you put it in the context of this very fucked up world in which, you know, a guy that gets bought as a slave is then romanced by the person who bought him. That's a lot to unpack that we're not getting into in this video specifically, but yeah. The problem with Hollow Heart is that a lot of the required plot lines of it, for it to continue, was that it required that you had read the Winter's Trilogy. If you hadn't read those books, you wouldn't have enjoyed this sequel, even if you loved Midnight Lie, because Midnight Lie didn't make those same references. So, realistically, it was a failure, and you should have just left Midnight Lie as standalone and left us all wondering what the fuck happened. So, that is a sequel that didn't need to exist. For a sequel that definitely, in a duology, that definitely should have been a trilogy, that's going to be Redemptor by Jordan y Fuego. I want to disclaim that I loved these books, and I loved the writing and the style. I think that this should have been a trilogy, though. This story deserved more time and more pages to develop the plot. The lack of that development made everything feel a bit rushed and jarring almost while reading it, like you can't catch your breath, and there were things that I wish that we'd gotten to spend more time talking about for my brain to fully process what was going on, especially as a young adult series. Young adult series are definitely fast-paced and can usually get away without building out on things. However, when it comes to magic and also like character development, I feel like we need a little bit more time on those things, because those are the things that a lot of people are reading those books for. Not political landscaping, that kind of thing. Not that, but like, why is this character doing this and what happened and whatever. And while Jordan y Fuego did a fantastic job of doing what they could within the story, I personally feel like it would have done better and benefited from being a trilogy instead of a duology. I would have liked more from the world and more from the story, and I don't want a prequel, and I don't want like a spin-off series. I wished this had been a trilogy instead of duology. Was it a bad book? No, it was a fantastic book, but it should have been trilogy. For honorable mentions in this section, I have The Red Queen, which, who is that by? Hopefully Editing Me will put the pictures of the books here, because I can't think of who the author is by. It is an Alice in Wonderland retelling. It didn't need to exist. It shouldn't have been written. It didn't do anything to benefit the actual plot of the story. You could have lived without it, and you would be fine if you never read it, which is exactly how I feel about Hollow Heart. Anna K. Away is the sequel to the Anna K. story, which is a retelling of Anna... I'm not even going to attempt to say that last name. Karina? Anna Karina. I think that's what it is, right? Anyway, a retelling of that. Yeah, I didn't care about it. I was good with the way that the first book ended. I mean, I wasn't good with it, but I was good with the open-ended ending. It didn't leave me feeling unfulfilled. I read a cute little contemporary romance retelling, and it had very drastic and dramatic things that happened, and then the sequel was just kind of like, okay, why did you write this? Both of those just didn't need to have sequels. This next section is a section that talks about literally why I have decided to make this video in the first place, and that is I'm gonna spend a lot of time talking about one specific book. So I'm just fair warning you now. This section, in my notes, I've titled it this really long name, which is, I think you forgot what the first book was about, / did someone else write this, / what the fuck was this? That's what I've titled this section. I would like to maybe call it moving away from the original plot, which I guess Hollow Heart also could fall into, but it's more of a this didn't need to be written situation. You know what? I'm going to start with the second book. I'm not going to start with the first book. We're going to start with the second book because I'll talk about it forever. The first book that I want to mention here is Namesake by Adrienne Young. This is the sequel to Fable. Fable had a heavy focus on found family and those relationships, whereas Namesake did not. Unfortunately for me, the draw of Fable was the found family dynamic that made me feel so emotional and attached to the characters and what happened to them. However, They threw away most of those concepts to focus predominantly on the romance side of that story, which I knew was probably going to happen by the ending of Fable into Namesake, but I was still disappointed by it because personally, as someone on the A spectrum, there are some romances that definitely lull me in and I think are fantastic. This was not one of them, and so to turn the focus of the book no longer on Fable and her family that she has now found and built out, but on Fable and this man's, I was just like, I don't care. I don't care, and I don't like their dynamic. And I also don't super love when a relationship comes out of a place of desperation and the power dynamic is not even. And that's kind of what happens here, and I just didn't super love it, and so I really didn't care for the second book. And I felt like the author got lost about what the original plot of the first book was and what the original character dynamics were, because it felt like reading a completely different book when reading Namesake. Like, the characters were named the same thing, but it was just a completely different book, and I didn't super love that. The other book in this category is Kingdom of the Cursed by Carrie Maniscalco. The first book in this series was a young adult novel. I also think the series was in the Jimmy Patterson book collection, so I think that it also had to go over to another publisher. I don't know about that, so someone fact check me because I could be wrong. The first book was a young adult book. It was written like a young adult book. The focus was on the magic and solving this murder and getting her sister and like doing all of these things. And it was super, super interesting. The romance was sort of a subplot that wasn't the hyper focus of the book, and it was very easy to read as somebody who doesn't care all that much about the romance, and even then, the romance in it was appealing to me. I love a bad demon man, king of hell. Love that. I love that he's like forbidden and kind of mean. I like that. That's kind of but his behavior in the first book is not the same as his behavior in the second book. In the second book, the book is no longer intended for young adult audiences. So if you were, a young adult who is still in high school, you don't get to read the second book. Enjoy, I guess. I don't fucking know. I don't know who the fuck decided that. That's not enough time for the books to grow up with its readers. What the fuck is that? Anyway, it is a new adult category now, reading category. And the reason it's considered new adult is because everybody fucks. Actually, no, they don't. They don't. There's a lot of foreplay until like 90% of the book. And I could probably tell you which chapters you needed to listen to or read in the audiobook, and that will give you all of the plot, and you can skip the rest because it is either foreplay or non-consensual sexual activity. And I don't mean like CNC, I mean like non-consensual. I mean this bitch didn't consent to it. I understand the rise of smut and erotica that happens with the book talk community. I understand it, and you know what? It has led me to read some spicy things that I would not have otherwise picked up. And I'm grateful for that, because it has led me to, some authors that actually are like, hey, this next chapter is a sex scene, you can skip it if you want to. That's fantastic. That means that your plot and your romance is bigger than just the sex. However, because there is such a hyper focus on let's see who can write the raunchiest shit, we lose the plot completely, and it does become porn in a sense, and that's very frustrating to me. I have no problem with porn. I have no problem with consuming erotic content. I have no issue with any of that if that is what you're personally into. I read the first book for a young adult fantasy with some romance subplot, but mostly I was reading it for the magic. The second book is a new adult erotic fiction that talks a little bit about the plot from the first book. A little tiny bit. Our character loses all of her personality. She has literally no personality anymore. She is flat as a piece of paper. Our demon king lord guy, his entire personality is let's see how much non-consensual shit I can convince her to do, but hey, at least I'm not as bad as my brothers because I could be. And she's like, you know what? That's right. That's totally a forgivable offense then. You could be worse, so that's fine. And you're telling me that you're taking this from a book that's supposed to be for teenagers to a new adult book? And I didn't even know that when I picked this book up. I did not know that it had changed to new adult. Do you think that teenagers are gonna know that? Probably not. And do you think that that is the content that they need to be reading? Absolutely the fuck not. They don't need to be reading that kind of content and thinking that this is an appropriate relationship, and it is quite literally never fucking addressed. And in many of the reviews, like, nobody talks about what chapter this happens in, nobody talks about this entire experience, like, nobody references it. In my review, I did write the chapter. I can't think of what it is off the top of my head because it's now been almost a year since I read the book. But regardless, this falls within the same category of the Curse of the Celts books, in which we normalize non-consensual sexual activity and think that, you know, oh, well, I had to because of X, Y, and Z. No, you didn't. I don't give a fuck. No, you didn't. And giving that languaging to teenagers, because I don't care if it's labeled as new adult, teenagers aren't going to see that. I didn't see that, and I'm an adult. I don't care if it's labeled as new adult, you are setting teenagers up to read that experience and assume that it is normal, and that is a failure on your part as an author. Absolutely a failure on your part. There should be at least content warnings in the beginning that talks about it. Like, I didn't go into this book thinking I was going to read erotic fiction. And to do that is a failure. Like, that's beyond sequel syndrome bullshit. That's like, you just wanted to write a different book series, so you just recycled what you already had. And it was bullshit. Go write fanfiction. Like, this was not it for me. Sorry, that's why I moved that book to the last, because I knew I'd go in on it, and it's frustrating to me. The honorable mentions for that is going to be All the Tides of Fate, which is a sequel in a duology, but I don't remember what the first book is called. But I do remember why I thought that it was like you lost the plot, and that's because in the first book, she acts like, you know, romance is not a priority and considers consent and that kind of thing, and it's important. And then in the second book, romance is the main priority of the entire plot, and we forgot what the book was about. And the next one would be Our Violent Ends, where, again, we kind of like lost the plot and focused too heavily on the romance, and I just didn't care for it. I think that a lot of the time lately, authors are kind of abandoning their very interesting plots or making them less interesting or less of the focus and hyper-focusing on the romance of the books, and I just am not really into it. Our Violent Ends is a little bit of an exception because I understand that it's a Romeo and Juliet retelling, kind of, so reimagining, I don't know. So like, that's a little bit different, but regardless, it's very frustrating as somebody who does not usually enjoy romance to be reading a book series that I'm really enjoying for the plot and then suddenly being forced to read a romance in order to find out what happened. I'd rather die, honestly. So like, at least be transparent. Hey, by the way, this is absolutely nothing like the first book. Enjoy. Like, you couldn't have written these books and assumed that it was the same as the first book. You just couldn't have. So, those are the bad sequels. Those are the books that I felt like you should have just not written these. You should have just not. It would have saved us all a lot of time, effort, emotions. It would have been, you know, better for everyone involved. And yet you did it anyway. You did it anyway. Congrats. I am going to recommend some very good sequels for you because I feel like if I'm going to bitch about really bad ones, I should at least tell you some really good ones. And we are going to start with Misrule by Heather Walter. This is the sequel to Malice, which is the Sleeping Beauty, Aurora, etc. retelling. This book did a really fantastic job of being a sequel. It's probably one of the best sequels I've ever read. While it does continue after, like 100 years after the first book, we see some character growth that makes sense to the character who is awake aging. However, we also see that because she has lived so hyper-focused in the past, she was not ever able to really grow as much as she could have. Whereas Aurora is herself, she's very much herself when the time comes, but there are some character development things where you kind of see the dynamic of, oh, Malice, Alice, Maleficent, whatever, has been alive for 100 more years, alive and awake and growing, whereas this character very clearly hasn't. And wow, you can see the difference in the dynamic because they have had so many different life experiences between this time span, which I think was done incredibly well and realistically because that makes sense to me. It included some new characters, a lot of new characters, but it also referenced old characters and lore and history that we already knew a little bit about and was introduced in the first book. So nothing was new, it didn't pull you into a plot you didn't know about, and it allowed for some humor and growth. The story didn't go where I necessarily expected it to go, but I wasn't mad about the ending. And by the time I finished it, I was like, now that's how you fucking write a sequel. That was literally my first thought was, now that's how you do that. Take notes. Like, it was that good. The next sequel is going to be Ironheart by Nina Varela. That is the sequel to Crier's War. And Nina Varela did a fantastic job because it literally felt like she just finished writing Crier's War and sent it off and immediately started writing Ironheart. So our character's development was on the same path. the same arc. Our characters' personalities and who they were stayed the same. Their core values stayed the same. And as they grew and developed, it just felt like a very solid continuation of Crier's War instead of feeling like, wow, this is disjointed and you really picked up and forgot where you left off, and that's cool, I do that all the time. This was genuinely like, have an understanding of your characters and your plot and your world enough, and you know your readers have an understanding of that they have a level of expectation in your next book, and you followed through on that, and it was really good. It just felt like the storyline was done really well and handled in a way that made sense to me. Whereas the other thing about this duology is that it is romance focused. Both of these are romance focused, like the actions that the characters are taking that is changing their worldview is based around romance specifically. However, at no point was I like, hey, can we get back to the plot now? Because I don't care about this. There was no point in either one of these books where I felt that way. And I know I only mentioned 2 books for all of the other sections, but this is because I just recently read the sequel, and I think that it is a good representation of how to tie in a book that maybe has a different plot, but is in the same world, etc. It's considered a sequel while having a different plot. And that would be Seasonal Fears by Seanan McGuire. Now this is the sequel to Middle Game, which if you guys have watched my channel, you know that that's one of my favorite books. And Seasonal Fears had me very nervous because Middle Game ended. It ended, so what, we got a little bit of a hint in the epilogue about what the next book could be about, but like, how does this tie into everything? And you do get that information. Seasonal Fears feels like a different book. It feels like it could stand on its own, but it has references to the characters in Middle Game and some of the relationships in Middle Game. It doesn't assume you read Middle Game, but it also ties in really well, so if you were to read these back to back, like I did, you would be just as excited about some of the characters making an appearance or finding out, like, oh, this is what happened to this character. Cool, I wasn't sure. Or, okay, so this is how, like, the world continues on after you have what happens to Roger and Dodger happen. I don't want to spoil it. And so I felt like that was really well done, because that's how you would write a book with a different plot. You're more than welcome to you're more than welcome to do any of these things that I'm saying are bad, obviously, but writing a sequel that is a different plot is not unusual. It happens, and it's done well a lot of the time. However, writing a book that is a completely different plot when it's supposed to be a continuation of the previous plot is a little bit confusing to me, because what are you doing? And that is where my frustration lies with a lot of the other books, is that you just wanted to write a different book. So why didn't you just write a different book? Seanan McGuire wrote a different book. It's just in the same world, and you got a lot of the context and content in the same way that Middle Game provided it to you, in pieces and chunks that makes it consumable without making it feel like, oh, well, you made a mistake tying this in, looking at you, Hollow Heart. So now you have to explain all of this shit to me because I didn't read this trilogy before, so... And that's also done in the way that the children's books, like Over the Woodward Wall and Along the Saltwise Sea, are tied into these adult books. You don't have to read them. You're just fine getting away with not reading them. However, the way that they tie in benefits you, and it's really cool the way that it's done. But you don't have to have read them to understand the plot of the other books, which is what Hollow Heart did incorrectly, in my opinion. And for my honorable mentions here, we're going to have Thronebreakers, the Kyoshi duology, Bone Shard Emperor, Harrow the Ninth, and Second Rebel, and As Good as Dead, which is a thriller. Most of these were fantasy or sci-fi. So that's my video on sequel syndrome. It's a little bit ranty, it's a little bit me just whining about things I don't like in romance-based books, but I think that it is fair to talk about how some of these books just shouldn't have been written or were very clear deviations from the original plot, and why that is so disappointing and upsetting as a reader. Obviously, I haven't written any books, so maybe, it's just because it's really hard to write the second book, but I don't write books, so I don't know the answer to that question. I have been wanting to make this video for a while, so I hope that it was satisfactory to you if you have heard me talking about wanting to make it for a while and have been waiting for me to make it. Here it is. Hi, hello, thank you for watching. Sorry that I got a little ranty there. I have very strong feelings, like I said. But I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. I post every Tuesday and Thursday at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time. So if you liked this video, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, share, etc. It benefits me a lot. It's very helpful, and also I have a really fun time replying to you guys in the comments. Sorry that it takes me a while to get to it, but I have a lot of fun doing it. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Like I said, if you didn't enjoy the video, let me know how I can make it better for you. If it has to do with my opinions, unless I am factually incorrect about something, I'm not changing my opinion. Thank you. I will see you guys again next week. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Don't forget to take your meds, drink your water, and do something today to take care of yourselves. Okay, thanks, bye.